Hi, I'm David. I'm going to talk about Disky business today. Um, in the overview, it says that I talk about asynchronous mass transfer, and it is connected, and I'll show how. We're at the conference on mass transfer stability, and the stability is determined by two parts, two sides of the equation. I'm going to talk about the right side of the equation, which has two terms in it that decide whether things are stable or not. The first term is changes in separation as a result of torques and mass redistributions. And the other one is about the shape of the Roche-lobe and its derivative to Q. And today I will talk mainly about main sequence accretors, disk mass transfer, and how asynchronous donors and stability will play into here. So this whole project basically comes from a desire to put disk mass transfer properly into population synthesis codes for reasons that some of us here are well familiar with. And but whether disk mass transfer occurs, that depends on the stream, the mass transfer stream, and the size of the accretor. And specifically, the size of the accretor has to be smaller than the radius of minimal approach of the stream, right? If mass transfer via disk occurs, there's a very strong torque, and this disk will spread outwards up until the torque between the outside of the disk, the outer edge, and the orbit equals, and then they start transferring angular momentum between them. A big part to this is calculating stream ballistic trajectory or stream trajectories to calculate this radius of closest approach. And this requires numerical integration, is usually assumed to be ballistic. And that's where this asynchronous thing will come in. But first, I wanted to know how prevalent is disk mass transfer onto main sequence stars. So I set up some population synthesis results, and I calculated some branching fractions. And what I basically find is that about 40 to 50% of all mass transfer onto main sequence stars is through disks in some way. And of all stable mass transfer, it's about 75%. But that's in some way, right? Is there any significant fraction of mass being transferred through these disks? That's on the plot on the right side. And it basically shows that more than 50% of these episodes transfer more than 50% of the mass through disks. Basically, what I wanted to know in my population synthesis calculations, is this in any way important? Answer is yes. So they appear in my population synthesis results. So we should probably have a good look at how we treat these things, right? The other question is, and that's basically the source of why I asked this, if material is lost from this disk, and Monica will understand why I asked this question, what impact does this make, right? Now, mass loss from an accretion disk can impose quite an extra torque on the mass transfer. Especially material at the very outside of this accretion disk carries a lot of specific angular momentum. If mass is lost from this accretion disk, it basically prevents this angular momentum from returning to the orbit. So it's already extracted from the orbit, but usually it's assumed to be returned to the orbit if no disk mass loss is included. And so if you do lose it, material will prevent this material, this angular momentum from returning to the orbit, right? As I show here on the figure, the gamma factor of this accretion disk wind is high. And the shape is more or less like losing mass from the donor because the material is at some point so far out that it's almost at the location of the donor rather than the accretor. And yeah, so what I'm showing is the maximum torque that accretion disk winds can exert. One small side note is that we cannot lose 100% of the mass at the outside of the disk. There's a balance between how much we can actually lose at a certain location. To move a certain fraction of mass outwards, you need to move the rest inwards, basically. So this is not a golden ticket to losing a lot of angular momentum, right? There's a balance here. But this is well studied. There's a lot of systems that are observed with accretion disk winds. And recently there's some attention on this in some papers, including Monica. Are you going to talk about this this week? Or? Okay. Okay. So, but it's also important to see how much angular momentum is actually transferred through these disks that we might be able to lose, right? And so, in my accretion for my population synthesis results, I looked at of all these systems that transfer mass through disks, what fraction of their initial angular orbital momentum is transferred and torqued back. And that's what we see on the left plot. We see that basically between 5 and 50% of the initial angular momentum, that's where half of the systems lie. So the other rest of the systems, they do transfer mass through disks, but it's not any dominant factor of their initial orbital angular momentum. And that on itself is sort of a natural way of expressing things in here. But now the critical point in my research is that I also found a lot of this mass transfer is non-synchronous. And what I find is basically of all this mass transfer through disks, 90% of this is severely subsynchronous. And that's a bit of an issue. And so I published a paper on this last year. What I basically find in my population synthesis results is that a very large fraction, either mass weighted or time weighted, is subsynchronous. Supersynchronous, not that much, but this is in the field, so there might be some changes here. But taking into account the asynchronicity is important, right? If 90% of the mass is transferred subsynchronously, we may need to do something about this. And so indeed, I set up ballistic calculations in which I changed the synchronicity factor of the system, which basically means how fast the donor rotates compared to the orbit, and synchronicity factor of below 1 is subsynchronous, so it rotates slower than the orbit. And a lot of things changed, like the radius of closest approach changed, the torque on the orbit changes, things like self-accretion back onto the donor occur, but that's always synchronizing, so it's a sort of stabilizing effect. And not taking it into account will overestimate the spin up of the donor, among other things, but also overestimate how much mass we could lose through disk winds. And the last part, to look into the stability of this, the asynchronicity also has an effect on the shape and the size of the Roche lobe. And that's basically what I'm showing on the left plot as a function of the accretor, the mass ratio. For different synchronicity factors, we see that the size of the Roche lobe changes. Everything super synchronous makes the Roche lobe size smaller than synchronous. Everything subsynchronous makes it larger. And there's sort of a span of factor of 0.7 to 1.2. That's the extent, like of how much the Roche lobe changes compared to the synchronous situation. But also the derivative of the angle of the Roche lobe to Q changes as well. And this makes an even larger span of differences. And it goes smaller for supersynchronous and larger for subsynchronous. And this goes into the stability calculations. So the response of the Roche lobe shape to Q, to the changes in Q, will seep into this. Now, if I put everything together and I look in an idealized situation of isotropic mass loss, then I'm basically finding that the effect of this change in the Roche lobe shape and its response to changes in Q is severely subdominant to the torque of the other things, right? It's good to have this answered because now my question is answered indeed. There is this very tiny strip where things might be slightly different, but the zeta is already very small here, and I don't think this is going to be a very dominant effect on the stability. But small asterisk, this is quite preliminary, and we may find that there are some more features. Overall, I'm finding basically this mass transfer plays a big role. Accretion disk mass loss could provide a large torque, but in order to get good statistics, we need to take into account the asynchronicity. Asynchronicity makes a change in stability, but it won't be dominant. So it's a very negligible effect likely. And these are the points that I want to make in my talk. Thank you.
start with Lika. I figured this out this time.
Nice, thank you. I just actually have very naive questions for my understanding of what you actually did. First, how do you determine what fraction of mass was transferred to a disk? Is this a parameter you set in your PopSynth, or is this you said it like it was an outcome, but I don't understand.
Yeah, well, so
you...
in every Rorschach overflow episode that I find in my population synthesis, I just calculate whether the stream, the radius of closest approach of the stream is larger or smaller than the accretor. If a disk then forms, I just tally up all the mass that's transferred, and then I make a different weighting, either time weighted or mass weighted, to express for every episode what the.
So it's a flag based on the size of the accretor.
Yeah, yeah.
And where the stream. How do you determine where the stream comes?
So in the right. So in this figure, basically it's an example of a ballistic trajectory. It starts here. This is for Q is 0.5 or something. It goes all the way around and hits itself again. And this radius of closest approach, I just query in this array of locations, where are you the closest to the accretor? That's my radius of closest approach. This number is indeed what changes. That's basically for all Q's and F's that I find. It changes as a function of synchronicity.
Okay, thank you. I have a really quick follow-up. Just QAC here.
Yeah.
The accretor goes to 100. The mass ratio goes to 100. Does that make sense? Like
I just take a very large range of values.
Okay, but that never happens,
right? No.
Okay, so you're actually just looking at the inner 2 points of your log scale plot.
So here,
0.1 and
this value,
0.10.
Yeah.
Those are pretty big ranges already.
These are the ranges I'm showing things in is large, yes.
Okay, thank you.
But I guess this could also be used in situations of extreme mass ratio systems.
Here next.
When you do the ballistic calculations for your stream, what do you take as initial condition for velocity? I'm asking because usually when you accept the sonic velocity, that works out only in terms when you have flow which originates from about the same position, and that works out in the normal corrotating. Now, for non-corrotating things, velocity is different, as it was discussed in the past. Yeah. So what do you accept for that?
So I add whatever is due to the non-synchronicity in there. So I
no. I mean, with what speed it crosses at one point?
Oh,
that's like in terms of as a multiplication of sonic velocity, because that was a subject of discussion.
Right. So in my paper, I explore this as basically another dimension of the issue. What is the initial velocity of the stream, as basically expressed in the orbital velocity? I sample in this dimension as well, and based on, I can show you in the paper where I got this initial velocity from.
I have a question. So how did you find out that the majority of the mass is transferred subsynchronous? Like, what is your basis for this?
Population synthesis results. Yeah. So I just spawned a whole population of binary stars and single stars and tallied up all of the situations in which mass transfer occurs, and then compare depending on how much mass is transferred or how much time is spent, whether it was synchronous or not.
So you had some assumption for the distribution of rotation velocities of the donor, or?
So I do realize in my paper, so both start basically non-rotating. So this might change things a little bit, yeah. But this is something we can easily check. Yeah.
I think we maybe have time for one more question. Lord.
I was just curious about that plot in the form last slide. So it kind of broadens a little bit with beta. One more, well, at the end, like this one, yeah. So it broadens or seems to broaden a little bit with beta. Is that like and like what is the property here is like the zeta version
Yeah.
over normal zeta?
No, well, so this is the range that my two extremes span, normalized to the value of zeta at that coordinate in this grid. So it's I had quite some difficulty with trying to see how to visualize this best. I think in any case, I'm finding that the effects only make a big difference in this region, in this strip here. So we don't really have to worry that much about this.
All right, I think it's time to hand it over to our discussion leaders. So let's thank David again.